Welcome to Class 2 for Bright Old Testament 514, the prophets. Today we're going to be looking at the late pre-exilic prophets, those prophets that ministered after the fall of Samaria to the Assyrians, leading up to the time that Judah went into exile in Babylon in 586 BC, shortly before and shortly after, so that not only are we looking at the late pre-exilic prophets, we could also say that we're looking at the early exilic prophets, as much of the ministry of Ezekiel and even some of the ministry of Jeremiah took place after the fall of Jerusalem in 586. So again, class 1, we looked at prolegomena and the early pre-exilic prophets, those that ministered in the northern kingdom prior to the deportation. Now we're going to be focused primarily upon Babylon and the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and then the early years spent in captivity. What exactly do we mean when we say late pre-exilic books? Well, the exile that we have in mind is the exile of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah to Babylon. That means that any book that is written prior to 586 BC is pre-exilic, which means that books that are focused on Assyria are called pre-exilic, not because they occur prior to the exile to Assyria, but because they take place prior to the exile to Babylon. They are early pre-exilic books because they take place early in that pre-exilic period. Assyria invades Israel and takes Samaria captive in 721. Nahum writes in 664 to 612, somewhere in that era, focused not on the fall of the northern kingdom, but focused on the fall of Assyria itself in 612 BC. Therefore, he is lumped in with those early pre-exilic prophets, even though he is getting very close to the late pre-exilic era. He's focused on Assyria, which is why I have him in column 1. In the late pre-exilic period, those that are focused on the exile of Jerusalem to Babylon, we have Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the latter chapters of Isaiah, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk. Again, they are all focused on the exile of Jerusalem to Babylon, the end of the southern kingdom. We, of course, have two prophets with unknown dating, Joel and Obadiah, which we'll look at in Lecture 3, and then the three prophets that are written after the exile, after the return of the southern kingdom back to Jerusalem. Daniel, of course, is apocalyptic and ministers during the early exilic period. The pre-exilic prophets, especially those dealing with Babylon, sometimes blur into a exilic period. They're written after 586. For instance, much of Ezekiel takes place after the fall of Jerusalem in 586, after the beginning of the exile. But since a bulk of his book is focused on that deportation, we still often call him a late pre-exilic book, but we could call him an exilic book and still be accurate. Some of Jeremiah as well takes place after the fall of Jerusalem, but his ministry is predominantly before the exile. The book of Zephaniah is set sometime during the reign of Josiah, who reigned from 641-640 BC, depending on the dating system, to 610-609 BC. We know that the book of Zephaniah is mostly answering the question, why is God delaying in terms of bringing his judgment? Why is the day of the Lord being delayed? However, we have the same question in Zephaniah that we have in Amos. People in Jerusalem are just as guilty of people in the northern kingdom of assuming that the day of the Lord only means judgment on the nations. Zephaniah comes indicating that yes, judgment is going to take place on the nations, but judgment is also going to take place on Judah. The difference is, especially at the end of chapter 3, there will be a restoration of Judah, a restoration of Israel. There's no such promise for the nations. They will be judged, ostensibly, permanently. Curiously, in chapter 1, we see the kings and the priests of Judah being called to a sacrifice. However, verses 8 and 9 makes it clear that the kings and the priests themselves are the sacrifices. They are going to be punished for their sin. Again, we see this judgment upon Judah in the midst of these declarations of judgment upon the nations. God is coming. The day of the Lord is coming. There will be no more delay, but it is not going to be a pleasant day. It's going to be a day of judgment on the entire world, the enemies of Judah as well as Judah itself for its own sin. The book does end, though, on that hopeful note. There will be restoration. Zephaniah uses a lot of cliche phrases that are found in other books. He speaks of the phrase, none to make them afraid. This is found in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 13. It's a phrase that's also found in the book of Leviticus, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel. It's a very common phrase, although you'll notice that Leviticus obviously is written during the era of Moses, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel take place in roughly the same time as the book of Zephaniah. The same with the phrase, not be put to shame, also found in chapter 3, verse 13. You can find that in Isaiah chapter 41 and following, but again, that is a similar era to when Zephaniah is written, as well as the phrase, my holy mountain, which shows up quite a bit in Ezekiel and Isaiah from chapter 55 onward. So that Zephaniah, while he's using cliche phrases used by other prophets, is using phrases that are applicable to his particular era. The other prophets that are using these phrases are also in the time roughly around Zephaniah. So it's not really surprising that he makes this statement in chapter 3, verse 13. It is a prophecy that is emphasized by a lot of the late pre-exilic prophets.
According to the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk ministers between 641-ish BC and 598 BC, during the reigns of Josiah and Jehoiakim, kings of Judah. The question that Habakkuk is wrestling with is whether or not God has seen the wickedness of Judah. God responds by saying, yes, I have seen, and I'm going to send the Babylonians, which then causes Habakkuk to question if that's fair. After all, Babylon is more wicked than Jerusalem, in which case God says, well, I'm going to destroy the Babylonians too, and reminds Habakkuk in that famous phrase in chapter 2, the righteous shall live by his faith. The Apostle Paul uses this in Romans chapter 1 to talk about justification, as does Martin Luther in the Reformation, justification by faith, having spiritual life instead of spiritual death. Habakkuk chapter 2, though, seems to be focused more on the ongoing living of life by faith, relying upon God and God's wisdom. Throughout the rest of Habakkuk chapter 2, Habakkuk delivers a series of 5 woes upon various groups of people, and ends the second chapter by saying, but, in response to the woes, the Lord is in his holy temple, and let all the earth keep silence before him. God is in control, and he is taking care of the wickedness by pouring out these woes upon his people, but also then upon the Babylonians. There is the question of a connection between Habakkuk and Job. One scholar has suggested that Habakkuk is familiar with the book of Job and actually uses the lessons that Job learned to come to a similar conclusion in the book of Habakkuk, that even though things don't always make sense, God is in control. Which is why in Habakkuk 3, then, we see a response, a psalm of faith of God's deliverance. Although it's interesting in Habakkuk chapter 3, there is God's deliverance apparently from the Babylonians, because it is the anointed ones, God's people, who are being delivered, even though God has already said that he's going to send the Babylonians against Judah and Jerusalem because of their wickedness. So even though in chapters 1 and 2 there's this reminder that there is a destruction, a woe that is poured out upon the wicked, there is still the rescuing of God's people in chapter 3. So Habakkuk, faced with God's wisdom, faced with what's coming for the people of Judah, responds with praise, exalting God for God's wisdom and also God's deliverance of his people.
The prophet Ezekiel was probably deported in one of the early deportations from Jerusalem to Babylon, roughly the year 592 BC. The city of Jerusalem falls in 586 BC, and Ezekiel ministers for another almost 30 years. There is a rough outline of Ezekiel that is chapters 1 through 24, chapter 25 through 32, and then chapter 33 through 48. We're going to look at each of these in more detail. For instance, in chapters 1 through 3, part of that first initial section of chapters 1 through 24, we have the calling and the vision of Ezekiel, as he sees the vision of the wheels upon wheels and the many creatures, as he sees a vision of God himself giving him a calling. Although he's told in chapter 3, verse 6, that he is guaranteed failure, God tells Ezekiel that if I wanted converts, I would have sent you somewhere else, but I sent you to Israel, and they're not going to listen to you. Ezekiel is going to be a prophet, but he's also mute. He is a mute watchman in chapter 3, verse 16 through 27. Eventually, he'll be able to speak freely, but for a while, he's going to be mute and only able to speak when God gives him a prophecy. He's also not able to turn. Ezekiel is probably the prophet, aside from Isaiah perhaps, that does the more bizarre signs. Jeremiah does several parabolic signs, but here the parables that Ezekiel is acting out are quite bizarre. He's mute. He's not able to turn. His wife dies. Several painful experiences that Ezekiel goes through, all foretelling the painful experience that Jerusalem is going to go through. Ezekiel is taken in the spirit to the temple back in Jerusalem prior to its fall, where he sees idolatry, a very shocking idolatry. And because of that shocking idolatry, Ezekiel also sees the glory of God depart from the temple in chapters 9 through 10. In chapter 11, we have the templeless temple, God basically telling the people that he is going to be a temple to them in Babylon, and he is going to give them new hearts. This is one of the first indications in Ezekiel of taking those hearts of stone and giving them hearts of flesh. The false prophet Pelatiah also drops dead. We have more signs and sermons in chapter 12 as Ezekiel is carrying baggage and digging through walls in order to symbolize when Zedekiah tries to go through the wall to escape from the Babylonians. We also have then Ezekiel condemning false prophecy as well as the failed elders of Israel in chapters 12 through 14, even indicating that if Noah, Jonah, and Daniel were present, still God would not spare Jerusalem. Although this last one, Daniel, may actually be Daniel, which was a famous wisdom character throughout Babylonian and Akkadian writings. It may not be Daniel as we know him from the Bible, but a completely different character that shows up in several other stories. The prophet Isaiah spoke of Jerusalem as a vineyard. Ezekiel speaks of Jerusalem as an actual vine in chapters 15, 17, and 19. In chapter 17, there is discussion about an eagle planting a vine and another eagle ripping up the vine, the second eagle being Nebuchadnezzar, who rips up the vine of Israel. Chapter 16 talks about a failed marriage between God and the kingdom of Judah, which is very reminiscent of Hosea chapters 1 through 3 and Hosea's failed marriage to Gomer. Chapter 18 talks about individual sin and individual repentance, that the soul who sins is the one who's going to die, which is quite different from the corporate focus that we typically see in Israel. Chapters 20 through 22 deal with oracles of judgment upon Israel and other nations. Chapter 23 deals specifically with two sisters, referencing the two sisters of Israel and Judah. Judah, however, sees the northern kingdom destroyed and yet does not change behavior at all. In chapter 24, Ezekiel's wife dies. This is a hard parable for Ezekiel to endure, and he's even told he's not allowed to weep. He's not allowed to mourn. Unfortunately, we don't know if Ezekiel ever gets his wife back. Chapter 26 appears to be unfulfilled prophecy because it speaks of the destruction of the city of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar. However, we know from archaeology and from other historical records that Nebuchadnezzar only destroyed part of the city of Tyre. The other part, the part that was out in the water as an island, was destroyed later by Alexander the Great, not by Nebuchadnezzar. However, this prophecy isn't really unfulfilled, it's just fulfilled in stages, some of the stages having to do with Nebuchadnezzar. We also have in chapter 28, we have a prophecy referencing the king of Tyre. It seems, though, as though there's more about Satan than there is about the king of Tyre. Many people have suggested that chapter 28 is actually the destruction and the fall of Satan from heaven. It is difficult to know if that's exactly what is being referenced, but that is a common interpretation. In chapter 33, we see a repeat of this theme of watchmen, that Ezekiel is supposed to be a watchman to Israel. He's declaring what is going to happen. Whether or not they believe what he's going to say is their own problem. In Jerusalem's fall, in chapter 33, Ezekiel is finally unmuted and he's allowed to say whatever he wants to say, having been muted ostensibly all the way since the time of his call at the beginning of the book. In chapter 36, we begin to have an emphasis upon the coming of the Holy Spirit, which is really reaching its climax in chapter 37 with the dry bones being restored and given new life according to that Spirit, as Ezekiel prophesies to. Chapters 38 through 39 talk about Gog and Magog. There's debate over whether or not Gog and Magog are literal or whether or not they are figurative of all the enemies of Israel and God's people. The new temple is talked about in chapters 40 through 42. Again, there is debate over whether or not this is a literal temple, or for those who hold to a premillennial eschatology, whether or not this is the temple, or whether, again, it's all figurative, referring to the church. Either way, the glory returns to the temple in chapter 43, much as it left in chapters 9 and 10, and water, a water of healing for the nations, comes out of the temple in chapter 47, really setting Ezekiel up as the new Moses, as the sacrificial system is reinstated and everything returns to as it was before the exile. Ezekiel has come back, as it were, figuratively, with the people, coming not from the west, from Egypt, but coming from the east, from Assyria and from Babylon, coming back to Jerusalem, reestablishing the temple system, reestablishing the worship of God at the temple. The glory of God takes up its return, takes up its presence in the temple, although we don't know of this ever actually happening. It seems to be just a figurative story, which then leaves the question as to what time frame it's referring to. Is it in the near future? Is it in the distant future? Does it have yet to be fulfilled? It's difficult to know.
Another prophet that is somewhat contemporaneous with Ezekiel, although Ezekiel seems to already be in exile in Babylon, is Jeremiah. Jeremiah, who's actually in Jerusalem and never goes to Babylon. So he overlaps, but not geographically. A rough outline of the book would be chapters 1 through 20, chapters 21 through 39, chapters 40 through 45, 46 through 51, and chapter 52. Chapters 1 through 20 are very general. Perhaps this is Jeremiah's words during the reign of Josiah, since Josiah is mentioned in chapter 3, verse 6. No other kings are mentioned. Chapters 29 through 39 has a lot of emphasis upon the king of Judah. However, there are three kings, and they're not chronologically mentioned within these sections. We have Zedekiah, Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim. In terms of order, Jehoiakim comes first after Josiah, followed by Jehoiakim, who's then exiled, and then Zedekiah, who becomes the last king of Judah. Jehoiakim is the father of Jehoiakim. Zedekiah is actually the brother of Jehoiakim, so he's the uncle of Jehoiakim. Within these sections, we have Zedekiah mentioned in chapter 21. Then the focus switches to Jehoiakim, who is the king before Zedekiah in chapter 22. Then back to Jehoiakim, who fathered Jehoiakim in chapter 25. And then Zedekiah in chapter 27 again in chapter 32. Back to Jehoiakim in chapter 36. Back to Zedekiah in 37. So we're jumping around quite a bit here, not necessarily chronologically, but again, the focus is on the decline of the reign of the kings of Judah until the very end. Chapters 40 through 45, the city has actually fallen to the Babylonians in chapter 39, and in chapters 40 through 45, it is after the end, during the period of the governorship, as eventually the people flee to Egypt, even though Jeremiah warns them not to. Chapters 46 through 51 are against the nations, and chapter 52 is the destruction of Jerusalem, again, taken from chapter 39, as well as a hope of reconstruction and restoration. So that is a rough outline and structure of the book. Now let's look at it in a bit more detail.
Jeremiah roughly is found during the time period of 627 BC to 585 BC, and perhaps a little beyond. Jeremiah himself may have written the book, although it's also possible, given chapter 36 and chapter 51, that Baruch is the one who wrote it all down. Chapter 1 is the calling of Jeremiah, commissioning him as a prophet to Israel. He's told that he's going to be persecuted for this position, but that God will indeed strengthen him, and that he will be used by God not only for blessing, but mostly for judgment. Van Gemeren refers to Jeremiah as the new Moses, because Jeremiah is applying the book of Deuteronomy to Israel. He's also called the weeping prophet because of his speeches, his soliloquies that he makes in complaint to God. Chapter 8 and 9, chapter 11 and 12, chapter 15, chapter 17, chapter 18, and chapter 20. One of the main speeches that is most famous in Jeremiah is the Valley of Slaughter in chapter 7. This would be the place where the Israelites were going and were offering their sacrifices, most likely to false gods, perhaps even offering up children as sacrifices. It became a place during the exile and the fall of Jerusalem where the bodies in Jerusalem were burned. It became known as the Valley of Gehenna, which is the imagery that God uses in the New Testament to speak of hell. We also have Jeremiah reminding the people that you can't trust in the temple because the tabernacle was at Shiloh and it was still overrun. Jeremiah performs several signs, one of which is buying a loincloth, burying it, and then seeing that it's spoiled, just as Israel has spoiled. Jeremiah is instructed not to pray for Israel. He does. You wonder if then this is considered sin and disobedience for praying when God said not to pray. Jeremiah also interacts quite a bit with lying prophets in chapter 14, and is told in chapter 16 that he needs to stay single, and that there is going to be a restoration upon Israel, but first there is going to be a double measure of justice, which is exactly what Isaiah 41 says. Israel has been punished double for all her sins. In chapter 17, Jeremiah addresses the Sabbath and the fact that Israel is not keeping it, and even when they do keep it, it's a burden to them. Chapter 18 talks of the potter and the clay, where the clay spoils as the potter is using it, but the potter is able to make it into something useful anyway, suggesting restoration. In chapter 19, a flask is broken, reminding Israel that they too were broken. Chapter 22 uses signet ring language, which is a reference to the Davidic line of kings. The signet ring here is going to be removed from Israel, but we know from later books, specifically Haggai, that the signet ring will be replaced. In chapter 23, we see the branch. The branch is again the Davidic king. Only in Zechariah, we find out that the branch is not only the Davidic king, but part of the priesthood, which is unexpected. Chapter 24 speaks about good figs and bad figs, using Israel's as an analogy of being good figs and bad figs. Bad figs obviously are thrown out while good figs are eaten. Chapter 25 speaks about the cup of God's wrath lasting 70 years or 70 weeks. This is the passage that the prophet Daniel will read in the future in order to understand how long Israel is actually going to be in exile. Chapter 28 is Hananiah the false prophet, as he opposes Jeremiah with some convenient, comforting words, but is told that he's a false prophet and he will die in exile. Chapter 29 is a lecture to the exiles who already are in Babylon, where Ezekiel, for instance, would be. Jeremiah gets himself in trouble because the people are really hoping that they are going to return quickly from exile, whereas Jeremiah tells them they're going to be there a while, 70 years in fact. 30 through 31 speak about a restoration of Israel, which is why Jeremiah buys a field in chapter 32, investing in the future, as it were. There's going to be a promised return. And not only a promised return, but also a promised change of heart. There's going to be a new covenant that is going to be written on people's hearts, a spiritual transformation that's going to take place, a spiritual restoration, in addition to restoring them to the promised land. Chapter 34 is a prophecy against Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, for his wickedness, promising that he will have his children killed in front of him, then his eyes put out. Chapter 35 is the exact opposite. It is a praise for the Rechabites, because they continue to follow the guidelines of their ancestor in not drinking alcohol, although God questions why they're able to follow the words of their ancestor, but Israel will not follow the words of their ancestor Moses. In chapter 36, the scroll that Jeremiah has been writing to the king is burned by the king in his winter palace, but Jeremiah rewrites the whole thing. Jeremiah is famously thrown into the cistern in chapter 38 and sinks down in the mud until he's rescued. And in chapter 39, Jerusalem finally falls. Nebuchadnezzar is pretty chill about it, though, and tells Jeremiah he can go wherever he wants, as though God had told Nebuchadnezzar both to sack the town and also to care for Jeremiah. Jeremiah does warn those who are left in Jerusalem, though, after the deportation to Babylon, not to go to Egypt, that Egypt too will fall. But they don't listen, and they apparently take Jeremiah with them, and Jeremiah likely dies there in Egypt. Chapter 45 is a blessing for Baruch because he has helped Jeremiah. 46 through 51 are a prophecy against the various nations that surround Judah, and then the events of the entire book are recapped in chapter 52, giving us a sort of end note to the whole book.
Some key verses in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 11 deals with all the curses of the covenant that are being poured out upon Judah because they're not following the covenant. God keeps encouraging them to follow the covenant, and they're not, so they keep having the curses from it. In Jeremiah chapter 31 through 33, God corrects the situation, not by reversing the curse and making it a blessing, but by saying that he's going to cause them to actually follow the covenant, by writing it upon their hearts and forming a new covenant. Not like the covenant that the fathers broke, chapter 11, but a new covenant. The covenant of creation is specifically mentioned in verse 20 of chapter 33, the covenant with the sun, moon, and stars, and the covenant with David is also mentioned in that particular passage. This is why many people speak of a covenant of creation when we talk about covenants throughout the Old Testament, because it's mentioned here. The Ark of the Covenant, however, in chapter 3, verse 16, is said to disappear, and that the people will no longer think of it. That's not completely accurate, because people have been thinking about it, not just Indiana Jones, but all sorts of people, including the Jews, have worried about it. Even in the book of Haggai, when it references the glory in the temple, the rabbis would often talk about how the glory was gone because the Ark of the Covenant was gone after the exile. So they still continued to worry about it, We just don't need it because God's throne is now within human hearts. But even here in chapter 3, verse 16, it is referenced that a day would come when it would disappear, which certainly has been the case. Jeremiah 29, verse 11 is the other famous verse within the book of Jeremiah. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. We need to remember, though, the proper context, remembering that this specific verse was written to Jews in exile in Babylon, and the plans to prosper was bringing them back to the promised land. So while we want to tie this verse to the New Testament, make it like Romans 8:28, it's not quite saying the same thing. It's certainly true God has plans and purposes for us. We see that in the book of Romans. But we need to be careful before we take Jeremiah 29 and slap it on everything that we do in the new covenant and saying that God is going to prosper us, because that is certainly not the case in a physical sense the way it was for Israel and for Judah. Instead, it's spiritual prospering as explained in Romans 8. We looked at the first part of Isaiah in a previous lecture, Isaiah 1 through 39, because those chapters are focused on the Assyrian period specifically, whereas chapters 40 through 66 are focused on the Babylonian period, looking ahead from Isaiah's day to when Babylon will come and invade Jerusalem and Judah. Even though those first 39 chapters are focused on Assyria, the focus is still largely on Judah, with some messages of woe and destruction upon Israel. 40 through 66 are entirely upon Judah and Jerusalem, because by this point, at least when it is fulfilled, the northern kingdom of Israel will no longer be in existence, having been taken into exile by Tiglath-Pileser and the Assyrians. The structure of 40 through 66 is fairly straightforward, although there is some debate about where exactly to divide it. Some wish to divide it after chapter 55, some after chapter 59. Some have said it's 40 through 48, 49 through 55 or 59, and then 58 through 66. The structure that I have here comes from Paul Wegner's commentary in the Tyndale Old Testament Commentary series, and I think he makes a good argument for why at the end of each section there is a refrain. In 48:22 it ends with, "There is no peace for the wicked." Again, 57:21 ends with the same phrase, "There is no peace for the wicked." And the book itself ends on a very negative note in terms of the destruction of the wicked, which is positive obviously from the one side, but sounds very similar to "there is no peace for the wicked," even those words are not exactly used. So it seems like this is a very serious structure that has been added in here by Isaiah to divide up the prophecies based on that refrain that occurs in those verses. So in chapters 40 through 48, which would be the first section, you could almost set it up as a chiasm, with King Cyrus being mentioned in chapters 44 through 45 as the center of that chiasm, 40 corresponding with 48, 41 corresponding with 47, etc. There is also a servant song, the first of the servant songs in chapter 42. We'll talk about the servant songs in just a moment, but this is where the first one is found. The next three are actually found in the second section, chapters 49, chapter 50, chapter 52 to 53, which is obviously the most famous one, the suffering servant. But this is the other placement of these songs. We have three in this section, one in the previous. This is the end. There are only four of them. Again, the section ends with, "There is no peace for the wicked." And then the final section is 58 through 66. 65 through 66, remember, we said, are sort of an inclusio corresponding to chapter 1 of the book. So in some ways it's 58 through 64, and then 65 and 66 are corresponding to that first chapter. But we say 58 through 66 here just for the sake of argument. Chapter 61 is the very famous, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And the book, at least in this section, ends with not just a final day of the Lord upon the nations, but the final day of the Lord. We recognize, especially in 58 through 66, that we're talking about the restoration of Israel, but on an eternal level, not just on a temporal level. So there is hope throughout 40 through 57, but the ultimate hope comes in 58 through 66.
It's hard to limit Isaiah to just one set of key verses. Another set of key verses, chapter 49, verse 6, is it too light a thing that my servant will raise up the tribes of Jacob? I'll make you as a light for the nations. My salvation will reach to the end of the earth. Again, chapter 49, verse 22, we have that signal being raised yet again, this time not to Israel, but to all the nations to come back to God. Chapter 52, verse 7, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who says, "You are God reigns." Very well-known verse. Chapter 55, verse 8, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. And then chapter 65, verse 25, which is very similar to chapter 11, verse 6, the wolf and the lamb shall graze together, the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and the dust shall be the serpent's food. They shall not hurt or destroy in all on my holy mountain, says the Lord. Again, looking forward to that future restoration, when the holy mountain is not just Mount Zion, but is the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, the new Zion. That's what Isaiah is ultimately looking forward to. A destruction by Assyria, a deportation by Babylon, but then a bringing back, not just bringing back to temporal Israel, but to eternal Israel. Perhaps the biggest question of interpretation in the book of Isaiah is, who is the servant? Is Israel the servant in the servant songs? Chapter 41, verse 8, you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. We see that again in chapter 44, 45, 48, 49, and so on. Again and again, Israel is referred to as the servant. And yet chapter 42, verse 19 says, the serpent is a failure. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as my dedicated one, or blind as the servant of the Lord? He's blind. He's a failure. Is Isaiah perhaps the servant? Chapter 50, verse 10, who among you fears the Lord and obeys the voice of his servant? Again, his servant, the prophet. And yet the servant suffers for many, which seems to rule out Isaiah. Chapter 52 and 53, we know these pretty well. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. H. Rowley, in his The Faith of Israel in 1956, sums it up well. The servant is at once Israel and an individual who both represents the whole community and carries to its supreme point the mission of the nation, while calling the whole people to enter into that mission, so that it shall be his mission and its mission, not merely his. The servant is Israel today and tomorrow, but Israel may be all or a few or one of its members. This is that idea of accordance. Is this a prophecy speaking of Christ? Absolutely. Are there other layers to this prophecy? Yes, definitely. Again and again, Israel is called the servant, and yet there are elements here that Israel cannot itself fulfill. Israel is the failed servant in chapter 42 and can't be the suffering servant in chapter 52 and 53 because of that failure. And so one has to suffer for Israel. And yet Rowley is correct. On one level, it's Israel, but on one level, it's the person who represents Israel. Jesus is the faithful son, where Israel has failed. Jesus is the suffering servant who suffers because Israel has failed.
Well, that brings us to the end of the late pre-exilic prophets, those focused on the deportation to Babylon. Make sure you go back and review this as many times as necessary to solidify the material, and I look forward to our discussion together.